We would all agree that to let the conference pass this year without stopping to do what John Marshall has just spoken of, marking the end of one of God's servants, to have let it pass without doing that would surely have been unforgivable. I do believe that it may well be in ages to come, in generations to come, that men will speak of the year 1981 just as we speak today of the year 1770 or 1892. When George Whitefield died in 1770, it was an end of an era. When Charles Haddon Spurgeon died in 1892, it was also an end of an era. And we are standing in a similar position. Now, if anybody is disposed to have any doubts about that parallel, I think it could be for a reason that they may not have considered. Both George Whitefield and Charles Haddon Spurgeon died, if I remember rightly, about the age of 57. In other words, they were taken away from the human appearance of things. They were taken away almost in the midst of their life and activity. They were not yet 60 years of age. Last month, on the first day of the month, Dr. Lloyd-Jones was taken home, not at the age of 57, but as you well know, at the age of 81. That means there is this difference in the parallel that I suggested. If there are men here who do not remember what Dr. Lloyd-Jones was doing at the age of 57, and indeed a number of years after that, if they do not remember what he was 20 years ago, then I may perhaps begin to forgive them if they have any slight doubts about my parallel. But the fact of the matter is that 20 years ago, Dr. Lloyd-Jones' ministry was at the very center of biblical doctrinal Christianity, certainly in England, in Wales, and a good deal further afield. Westminster Chapel was the center of radiating influence. Dr. Lloyd-Jones's ministry was behind and leading every Reformed, Evangelical, Calvinistic conference. He was at the center of the Puritan conference. He led, to a large degree, the work of the Evangelical Library, the Brethren in Wales. He was very largely concerned in the work of the InterVarsity Fellowship. He was as influential in Glasgow as he was in Cardiff. If there are then men here who do not know what Dr. Lloyd-Jones was 20 years ago, then they do not entirely appreciate what the church was given. In other words, I'm suggesting to you, indeed more than suggesting because I know it is true, that in the case of this servant of Christ, God did not suddenly remove him, but very gradually he moved not into the shadows, he was never there, but he moved slightly from the center of the stage. And I believe that there were very clear providential reasons for that. Had he been taken at the age when Spurgeon or Whitefield was taken, we should have faced an immeasurable blank. God indeed could have supplied that, but it was not his purpose to take him then. He was spared much longer to us. I do not doubt the parallel is perfectly accurate. The year 1981 should be remembered and will be remembered as the year when Dr. Martyn Lloyd-Jones died. Now, so many of us could speak in a personal way of what he meant to us. I think there must be comparatively few men here who do not consciously know their own loss. And as I thought about attempting to speak to you, I was very conscious of the fact that you have something, brethren, far more valuable this evening than any words that can be spoken. You have living memories. He was in your pulpits. He was in your homes. He was in our hearts. And therefore, to begin to speak what are words when we even remember something of what he was in flesh and blood. So many of us would not even have been here this evening had it not been for the work of God in his servant. Indeed, one can go further than that and say that in all probability this conference would not have been here. All would have been different. And yet in saying that, we say it not to magnify a servant of God, but to acknowledge the grace of God that was in him, and the power and the lively faith which God granted to his servant. Now, in speaking this evening, I am not going to attempt any kind of life story, nor even a tribute. I wanted to try to do something more personal. And in saying that, I bear in mind that probably I go down on tape, and if any of you brethren are in any possibility taking tapes, then I beg you to be discreet in how you use the tape. I am not wanting to read from a manuscript. I do not care to be quoted in print for every word I may say this evening, but I want to speak to you and to you who knew him. And if people will possibly listen to a tape in days to come, they also must understand that I am speaking here to brethren who knew him, who loved him, who were often in his presence. It's not my purpose then to give you an account of what he was or what he stood for. I want, I say, to be rather more personal and to try to speak largely from the standpoint of the last 18 or 16 months of his life. And I do that because, as you know, in that period, he was, to a very large extent, withdrawn from his previous public work. Not entirely, as I shall mention, but very largely. Now, in the late 1950s, I had the great privilege of assisting Dr. Lloyd-Jones. It was a misnomer, of course, a great misnomer. Dr. Lloyd-Jones's assistants were present for their help, not his. But that's what the title was. And then in 1961, I left Westminster Chapel, and in the years that followed, I did in London, and even when I was in Scotland, I had the opportunity to see him, to talk with him from time to time, as we all have done. But in God's providence, in the last 18 months, I saw him rather more than that, rather more often and more frequently. And therefore, I hope I can say something, brethren, that may be helpful to you who did not have the opportunity to speak to him so much just towards the end. Now, let me remind you, as most of you well know, that his preaching ministry in Westminster Chapel ended abruptly at the beginning of March in the year 1968. At the end of February, the beginning of March, he took ill. He was seriously ill, and he had a major operation. From that operation, he wonderfully recovered. There must be a number of us present who recall how he returned to the Westminster Fraternal the following October and gave an address on preaching. How animated he was. What an address that was. He had come back from major surgery. God had restored him, and he was, to a considerable extent, full of his old vigor. And God gave him to us for a further 11 years. 11 very important years. And it was only in the summer of 1979 that there were signs that his health was failing. He took the Evangelical Library lecture. He chaired it, I should say. One of our brethren here was speaking that year. He chaired that meeting, but he was not able to go to his beloved ministers' conference at Bala. If there was anywhere he could have got to, it would have been to the Bala Welsh Ministers' Conference. He could not go in the summer of 1979, nor could he, later in the year, go to the Westminster Conference. His last Westminster Conference was in the preceding year. And it was really only in November of 1979 that he once said that he was conscious that he was getting old. And there were symptoms that his health was not good. I saw him in November of 1979. And there are two particular memories that stand out concerning that meeting in November 79. The one was this: he knew that his health was deteriorating, and he hoped to go to a clinic in Florida for treatment. He had not been in the States since 1969, and he had not expected to go again, but he had heard of a clinic where particularly good work was done, and it was his hope to go towards the end of December 1979. And as he spoke about that, he said something which was not, I'm quite sure, not intended to be reminiscent of a verse in Daniel chapter 3, but which to me was very reminiscent of the words in Daniel chapter 3. The words of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when they were confronted with the possibility of death. You remember how they said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "Our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods." Well, there was the alternative. Our God is able to deliver us, but if not, the alternative doesn't frighten us, we still won't serve your gods. What he said was, I hope to go to the Florida Medical Clinic, but if not, or rather I've missed something out, I hope to go, and if the treatment is helpful, to carry on my work as before. But if not, well, I shall do what I can. Well, it was, but not. He was not well enough to go when December came, and so, as you know, he never did go across the Atlantic again. But he was perfectly satisfied with either alternative. I didn't see him again personally until March of 1980. And by that time, there was a very apparent change in him. He was obviously weak. He had lost a great deal of weight. He sat quietly in his chair in his room at home at Ealing. But when he began conversation that day, he was more fervent than I had seen him for a long time. I don't think I was ever more moved than the conversation we had that day in March 1980. And he was not speaking of possible treatment or possible recovery, but the subject that was largest in his thoughts was the subject of preparation for death. That was his subject. And he began by referring to some words of the famous Dr. Thomas Chalmers. Thomas Chalmers once said that it's greatly to be desired that before death, Christians have time to prepare, time to disengage themselves, time to withdraw from the busyness that so occupies us. Chalmers said that if we live 80 years and 10, then by the time we have reached the 7th decade of our life, that decade should be like the Sabbath. It should be a preparation for heaven. Now, the doctor began by quoting these words of Chalmers. And then he said this: "I agree with Chalmers absolutely. We do not give enough time to death and to going on. It is a very strange thing, this. Death is the one certainty, and yet we don't think about it. We are too busy. We just allow life and circumstances so to occupy us that we don't stop and think. I am grateful to God that I have been given this time." Then he went on, people say about a sudden death that it is a wonderful way to go. I've come to the conclusion that that is quite wrong. I think the way we go out of this world is very important. The hope of sudden death is based upon the fear of death. It is a hope of wanting to slip through death rather than to face it. Brethren, I wish you could have seen him speak on those words. The hope of wanting to slip through death, he said, instead of facing death. Death should be faced victoriously. And then he said, repeating what he had said a moment before, "I am grateful, therefore, for this experience. And maybe my present trouble is to give me this insight. And my great desire now is that I may be able, perhaps, to bear a greater testimony than ever before," meaning in the face of death. And that sentence alone is enough for me to know that he would not be displeased this evening to know that I was speaking to you on such a subject. He wanted to face death and to face it with Christian testimony. In the course of this conversation, I spoke to him of a Christian that I knew who had died gloriously, but had lived rather feebly as a Christian. And I said to the doctor, wouldn't it have been a great thing if that man could have lived as he died? You know, I got a mild rebuke. He was not impressed with that statement. Because, you see, he detected something in it. And this is what he replied. He said, "Don't underestimate dying. Death is the last enemy." He repeated it. The last enemy. Men may live well who do not die victoriously. In other words, I had been saying, oh, here's a Christian, he died gloriously, but, well, the doctor said, if he died gloriously, don't underestimate what that means. It is a great thing. And then again he said, it is idiotic that men do not prepare to die. And then he spoke more fully than I can say now on the folly of supposing that being ready to die is something to do with age. And he referred to George Whitefield and to that famous conversation with one of the Tennant brothers in New Jersey. And he took the side of Whitefield that though he was in his 20s, he was ready to go. Well, there was much more said, but that was the heart of it. And above all, it was thankfulness on his part for having been given time to prepare to die. Well, when I left him in March, on that day in 1980, I scarcely knew whether I would see him again. I hardly thought that it was possible unless I made haste. But the truth is, as a number of you well know, that not only did we see him again, but we saw him in the pulpit again. In May of 1980, he preached in Glasgow. I could hardly believe that it would be possible, but he was there. And those who were in that service in Glasgow will not forget it. He preached for an hour from the second psalm and finished with tremendous earnestness and passion on the words, "Kiss the Son lest he be angry, and ye perish from the way when his wrath is kindled but a little. That sermon is on tape. And after that sermon, he did something that I had never seen him do before. He literally, at the end, he had to sink and sit on the pulpit steps, white, silent, exhausted. It was an amazing fact that he was there. And I believe he had gone for any reason, perhaps this above others, to help and encourage the many younger ministers who were there, men who will speak of it many years hence. Then he went by car down to North Wales, to Llandomaltry. He preached there on the Sunday evening, and then for the last time in Wales at Aberystwyth the following week. It was his last tour, the last of thousands of tours. And so from the beginning of June 1980, his public work was really finished. He preached at Ashford at the beginning of the month, the first Sunday. He came up near here to a last fraternal, which some of you brethren were at. He preached at Barkham, and that was his last sermon. I don't think he was seen in public, as far as I know, again after that. He was at home in Ealing. He was in Balsham, at his son-in-law's home and daughter's home. For a little while in the summer, he took a brief walk or two, but that really was the end of being away from home. From the summer of last year to his death a month ago, he was at home in Ealing, except for a few brief visits to hospital. Well, after then he was confined to home, and incidentally, he was never confined to bed. To the end of his life, with only one exception, which I will mention in a moment, he had all his faculties. His mind, his memory, they were in full strength to the end, which is a wonderful thing and a great blessing. He didn't spend a day in bed. He sat in his chair quietly there in his room. Now, I saw him then in July of 1980 in Ealing. I had been with Al Martin in South Africa, as I mentioned briefly this morning. When I arrived in his room, he had a text. It was a text for me, and it was a text that he'd obviously been preaching to himself. But this was the text. And the 70 returned again with joy, saying, Lord, even the devils are subject unto us through thy name. In this, says our Lord, in this rejoice not that the spirits are subject unto you, but rather rejoice because your names are written in heaven. He was full of that text. The lesson of the text, he said, was this: if we are living on what we do, if our happiness is based upon our preaching or upon our service for Christ, there is something deeply wrong with it. Rejoice not in this, says our Lord, but rejoice that your names are written in heaven. He said the ultimate test of a preacher is what he feels like when he cannot preach. It is a real snare for the preacher to live upon preaching, that is, upon his preaching. People say to me now, it must be very trying for you not to be able to preach. No, he said, not at all. I was not living upon preaching. I can and do rejoice. It was a great privilege to hear him say that, and very searching. And he then went on to say, although he couldn't now preach, God was helping him to pray. And it was very moving to know how many of you, brethren, he was praying for. Some of you know that. Others of you, I'm sure, don't know it. He had very much upon his heart a great number of men in the ministry of the gospel, and he was rejoicing in the quietness that God had given him to give more time to prayer. And he was not downcast that he was not preaching. At that same time, in July 1980, he spoke again about dying. He said, we should face it like this. First, we all have to die. That is a fact. It is common sense. But where does Christianity come in? The Christian is not afraid of death because he has the assurance he will not be left alone. And then he quoted from the parable of Dives and Lazarus, and he drew attention particularly to the words, the beggar died and was carried by the angels into Abraham's bosom. The angels, he said, the angels came. I believe in this ministry of angels. I think of it more and more. And then he went on to say that death is not parting only, but more it is meeting. And although it is an experience that we have never passed through, we have the assurance that nothing can separate us from the love of Christ, and that in death we will meet with him. He spoke of an old man in his first congregation at Sandfields, and the doctor had been at his deathbed, and the man was just at the extremity of life when suddenly he threw up his arms and his face shone, and he was already meeting the Lord to whom he was going. The doctor spoke of the reality of that in the language of faith. We are going to be with Christ. And then he said, our greatest trouble is that we really don't believe the Bible exactly what it says. Exceeding great and precious promises. We think we know it, but we do not really appropriate this and actually believe it is true for us. This is Christianity, he said to me. Then he quoted those two verses we so often heard him quote. Here we have no continuing city. And again, our light affliction, which is but for a moment. We have to take these statements literally. They are facts. They are not merely ideas. Then he said, and he wasn't speaking to me here so much as to all of us, he said, this is what I feel you people have got to emphasize more and more. They are facts, not mere ideas. This is what you people have to emphasize more and more. Well, that was July 1980. In October, I saw him again in his home. There was a further change in his health. He was sitting still in his chair as he had been in July, but this time he wasn't rising to his feet. He was patently weaker. And on that day in October, he was full of the subject of the wonder of the grace of God. And quoted more than once the hymn that, again, we all heard him quote so often, my hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust my sweetest frame, but wholly lean on Jesus' name. And the next verse, with his covenant, his blood, support me in the whelming flood. When all around my soul gives way, he then is all my hope and stay. I don't want to say more on that afternoon except to say that that was indeed the very heart of his testimony. He referred to the words of old Daniel Rowland at his death, a poor old sinner saved by grace, and much else of similar vein. Then in January of this year, the thing that struck me in meeting him in January was the extraordinary seriousness which characterized him. People said the doctor didn't laugh much, and I suppose that is true. But he smiled a great deal, didn't he? But you know, I never saw him smile as much as towards the end of his life, when he had lost so very much weight and was very thin and emaciated towards the end. His smiles were more and more pronounced, and his face, without exaggerating, his face often seemed to glisten, but he was desperately serious. Then in February, at the beginning of February, I saw him twice again, and that was the last conversation I had with him face to face. I spoke to him on the phone after that, but not face to face. And he was quite evidently, going down. And he knew that. He simply did not know how long it would be, but throughout February he was losing ground until the last week of the month. At the beginning of the last week of the month, it became clear that he was losing the power to speak. He didn't suddenly lose it, but just gradually his breath went. One of the last times he spoke was this. His consultant had come to see him, a Christian man who used to go to Westminster, and his consultant was speaking with him, and the doctor wasn't talking, but he could say a great deal, as you know, by nodding his head and by his look. The consultant said that he wanted to give him some antibiotics. The doctor just shook his head. Well, said the consultant, he said, when the Lord's time comes, even though I fill you up to the top of your head with antibiotics, it won't make any difference. The doctor still shook his head. I want to make you comfortable, more comfortable, the consultant said. The doctor said nothing but shook his head. Well, then the consultant said, you know, he said, it grieves me to see you sitting here weary and worn and sad. That was too much. Not sad, he said. Not sad. Not sad. Must have been one of the last things he said. I can't tell you exactly what was, but that was certainly amongst them. Well, then, through the rest of that week, he gradually lost all powers of speech. But yet, without speaking, he was in full communication by smiles, by gestures, by... It's hard to describe, but he spoke with his face, and I'm sure there was not a moment when there was not communication. Sometimes, of course, he wrote on a bit of paper. On the Thursday night, he wrote for Mrs. Lloyd-Jones and his daughters. He said, don't pray for healing. Don't hold me back from the glory. It was hard to read that note. It was kind of, well, those of you who saw his writing, it was often hard to read. But this was particularly hard, except for the word glory. That stood out in the center. Don't hold me back from glory. Well, Friday of that week, he was meeting with a few people. He was full of smiles. On Saturday, he was lower. He was semi-conscious for some hours of the day and sleeping other parts of the day. And then, by late in the evening on Saturday, it was evident to Mrs. Lloyd-Jones he was unconscious. He was still sitting in his chair in his usual place in his room, but he was unconscious. And you know, it was a very wonderful thing that right to the end, Mrs. Lloyd-Jones had been able to get him up in the morning and help to dress him. No one else had been needed until that last evening of his life, as it proved to be. There was no way that she could get him to bed. He was unconscious, just there, quietly in his chair. So Mrs. Lloyd-Jones and her younger daughter determined to ring the ambulance men. And 2 men came quite quickly, and in God's goodness, these men were wonderfully kind. They carried him to the bedroom. He was undressed and put to bed with perfect ease and quietness and comfort. And after he had been in bed for just a short time and Mrs. Lloyd-Jones had gone out, he came round, and his daughter Anne was there, and at once he knew exactly what was happening, but he was obviously looking for Mrs. Lloyd-Jones. Round the room, she wasn't there. And then she came in and she asked him if he would like a cup of tea, and he nodded. He drank half a cup of tea, and they had a beautiful half hour with him. And then, quietly, he went to sleep. And that's how he went home. When Mrs. Lloyd-Jones woke up beside him in the morning, he had gone. That text in Psalm 37 is so appropriate. It was an abundant calm and peace. Well, time is going, indeed. I had a few main things I wanted to draw out, and I'll have to... well, my first one, it's maybe you think it's a small point perhaps, but some of the reading that he got through in his lifetime was wonderful, but to the end he was reading. And I could give you quite a list of books that I know he was reading, and there were others that I don't know he was reading, but it's a remarkable thing. And it's a great rebuke to us. The aged Apostle Paul in his prison, anxious that the cloak that was left at Troas should be brought, and the books, and especially the parchments. The doctor was like that to the end. He read, he loved to read. Right to the end. You know, he read McChain's division of the Bible every day. He had done that from the beginning of the 1930s. The reading on that last day of his life, Saturday, the end of February, was 1 Corinthians 15. That was the last passage of Scripture that was open on his knee on the last day of his life. 1 Corinthians 15. He believed every minister should read through the whole Bible at least once a year. He read morning, noon, and night. And if he could exhort us, I'm sure he would go on exhorting us as he did, to let nothing interfere with our reading. If we are to feed the souls of men, we must ourselves be prepared and cut off things that will prevent our doing this. I must go on. The theme that he spoke of so very frequently in those last months was the wonder to him of the guiding hand of God, the providence of God. I don't think that he spoke of anything perhaps more than that. The way that God intervenes, the way that God does things that we never for a moment imagined. Now, his life was full of things like that. As most of you know, he was well set at the beginning of a great medical career. He was chapel going, he belonged to a church, he became a communicant when he was 14. He had apparently a well-integrated life, a great career in front of him, and then at the age of 22, 23, crisis about 24, he was smitten with conviction of sin. Began to discover that he'd never been a Christian at all. Let me read you just a few words he wrote at that time. He said, "I shudder when I realize how unworthy I am and how ignorant of the dark hidden recesses of my soul, where all that is devilish and hideous reigns supreme." Conviction of sin. And then by the beginning of 1925, probably earlier, but certainly by then, rejoicing in the wonder of the gospel. He had a little room in St. Bartholomew's Hospital next to the post-mortem room. And that little room became a true sanctuary. God met him there. There were days when he knew unmistakably that he was face to face with God. Easter time, 1925, the reality of the death and the resurrection of Christ shining upon him. and almost simultaneously with his conversion, his call to the ministry, which posed new difficulties for him. He struggled against it. His own minister told him it would be foolishness. He could do more good as a doctor than he ever could do as a minister. And then, irresistibly, he was compelled to enter the work of the ministry. That was a wonderful thing. Wonderful in many respects. But one, of course, was this. You know how God took the apostle of the Gentiles, took him from the center of the school of the Pharisees, from the feet of Gamaliel, took the very man who was in that context to set him into the preaching of the word of the gospel of Christ. And in the 1920s and much later, the great opposition, apparently, to the Christian faith was in the idea that modern civilization and modern science in particular has reached a point of knowledge and education where it is simply impossible to preach creation in 7 days, impossible to preach Genesis 3 as history, that our knowledge of man and all his background has delivered us out of that kind of attitude. And you know, there were multitudes of men in the pulpit who, while they had not altogether accepted those ideas, they were inhibited, they were overawed, they didn't know how to cope with them. They were subdued and muted because it seemed to them that science was speaking with such authority that who were they? And God then took a man from the center of a scientific school, one of the greatest hospitals in the world, assistant to Sir Thomas Horder, who was one of the most brilliant rationalists and humanists of his time. And from the midst of all that, he brought a man who would preach the word of God. We all, says Paul, had our conversation in times past in the lusts of the flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature the children of wrath, even as others, but God. And on those words in his commentary, I think it is in Ephesians, the doctor says, whatever authority I may have as a preacher is not the result of any decision on my part. It was God's hand that laid hold of me and drew me out and separated me to this work. I am what I am because of God's grace, and I give to him all the glory. Were I to believe that my future is dependent upon myself and my decisions, I would tremble in fear. But I thank God that I know that I am in his hand. Well, in those latter months, he said many things like that. Well, we know what happened afterwards. But when Dr. Lloyd-Jones entered the ministry, his one intention was to be a missioner, an evangelist in a mission hall in South Wales. He went to such a work in 1927. That was all he thought of. He never dreamed for a moment of becoming in any sense a defender of the faith or an itinerant preacher. This is what he said a few months ago. When I went to Sandfields, if anyone had told me I was going to do what I have actually done, I would have told them they were mad. I was going to be an evangelist in a local mission hall. There is only one explanation, he said, for what happened afterwards: the sovereignty of God and the guiding hand of God. Well, it is very wonderful how that was through his life. In 1938, he was guided to London. His own thoughts were turned to North Wales. He more than half expected to go to Bala to teach in the theological college. Instead, he found himself at Westminster Chapel. It seemed to be, as people told him, a great field of opportunity. That's not the reason he was there. But then, although that was God's sure guidance, there came the terrible desolation of the war. A great congregation, 2,000 people, reduced almost overnight to a couple of hundred. Older people evacuated, the young people all called up to the services. Can you imagine what it was like to see a building that had been filled suddenly dwindle away almost to nothing? And it was a serious question in the minds of some people how they could possibly support two ministers, because of course Campbell Morgan was still alive and preaching. In other words, the doctor would say, in reference to that and other things, we are not to doubt the guidance of God because we're faced with difficulties. Not at all. And those difficulties went on through several years. There was that well-known Sunday morning in 1944 when, as he was praying in the earlier part of the service, they could hear a flying bomb literally coming to them. And then the very worst thing, as it came, dead silence. And of course it was when it was silence that the danger was so imminent. The doctor was praying. For a moment he paused, and then he went on. And the rocket cleared Westminster Chapel and came down on the chapel at the Guards Barracks just a few hundred yards further on. Many, many people were killed. I forget the exact number. The whole of Westminster Chapel shook. When people opened their eyes after that prayer, they were white with dust that covered them. Someone had to come up into the pulpit and clean the desk and the doctor before he went on with the service. He took no notice of it. No notice of it at all. But what I'm saying there is the guiding hand of God, and what he said to me and what he would have wished me to pass on to you is that we must also always know and believe that God's hand day by day is upon his people. He is concerned for us. He does lead us. And there are 1,000 ways that that comes out in the doctor's life. Let me just mention one before I hurry on. In 1938, towards the end of 1938, a gentleman was coming down a street in London and needing a chemist's shop. He found a shop run by a man called John Phillips, and he went in and he bought the item that he needed, and then he began to talk to Mr. Phillips. And this gentleman's name was Geoffrey Williams, and he had a problem. He had, down in the country south of London at Beddington, a very considerable library. Nobody was interested in it. For one thing, it was full of old Puritan and Reform books. And Geoffrey Williams started to talk to John Phillips about this library. And Mr. Phillips said, "You know, I believe I know the very man that you ought to meet." And so, a few days later, Dr. Lloyd-Jones went down to Beddington and saw that library. Seems an insignificant thing, but great multitude of events turned upon the coming of the Evangelical Library into London later on. Well, I wanted to say a few words on faith in God. Faith in God. Be careful for nothing was a text he quoted very often in these latter months. Be anxious for nothing. God's purpose, God's love, they are invincible. Christians have no business to be dismayed. And you know, it struck me very often as he spoke that he took a long-term view of things. We're not to get excited, we're not to get disturbed, we're not to get alarmed about what's happening at this moment, because all time is in God's hands. He reigns. We can be calm, we can be peaceful. We are to be careful for nothing, but to commit all to him. Made me think of the words, "Oh, the peace we often forfeit. Oh, the needless pain we bear." He said once, near the end, he said, "All my life I've been having to make decisions," he says, "for others, for my family, for you, brethren, in the ministry. And now," he said, "I am to make no more." And he was just speaking like a little child. And then, in words that I can't quote at this moment, he went on to say that that was no concern of his, that that moment had come, because he knew that the God who had helped and guided us in former days would be with us still. No need to be concerned. God himself is in control. Now that faith in God, of course, in the doctor was bound up with his faith in the truth. And this is a very big subject, but let me just touch on it very briefly. You know, in the later 1940s, Dr. Lloyd-Jones stood very much alone. In the late 1930s, he was a prominent figure in the Free Church Federal Council. It was the hope of many of the leaders of English nonconformity that Dr. Lloyd-Jones would be the leader in the years to come. They were grooming him for that. He had to face a crisis. And in 1942, he reached that crisis and he withdrew from any possibility of leading men who he knew could not be led. But not only did he become more apart from the general stream of nonconformity, he was more apart from evangelicalism. Not apart from it in sympathy or friendship or concern to help, but simply apart from it in his consciousness that it was adrift from so much that was essential to true doctrinal Christianity. Perhaps I could just tell you how I first heard the name of Dr. Lloyd-Jones. It was rather remarkable, at least to me it was, and I shall never forget it. I was a young Christian, very young Christian, and I was trying to help at Hildenborough Hall in Kent. Some of you know the work that was done by Tom Rees and the extent to which God owned and blessed that work. And many, many men, evangelical leaders, came and spoke at Hildenborough Hall. And for a few months, I was helping there. One conference had ended, and one Friday afternoon, when everybody had gone, the staff, the junior staff, I should say, were talking together. And I'm ashamed to say, I think it was myself. I think I said, you know, all the greatest preachers and speakers all come here to speak. And it seemed as though everybody agreed, except for one young lady in the corner, who suddenly spoke, and she said, oh no, she said, that's not true. So there was silence. And she explained, she said, Dr. Lloyd-Jones doesn't come here. It's the first time I'd ever heard his name. And somebody asked, why doesn't he come here? How can that be possible if he's one of the... Then I heard another new word that I don't know that I'd heard that word before. She said quietly, he's a Calvinist. Well, I don't know that that's the best way to put it, but the fact of the matter is that the doctor did have a lonely furrow for many years. It wasn't that he cold-shouldered anyone. You know that very well, brethren. But he found that there were many circles in which he could not work with a good conscience. But you know, that meant that in the 1950s, when the Spirit of God in different parts of the country and in different parts of the world, when the Spirit of God stirred up men to turn back to older works, to Jonathan Edwards, Bishop Ryle's Christian leaders, Whitfield, men in different places began to read. And then the question was this: is there anyone alive who has a church where these things are preached? Is there anyone anywhere? And there was. And you know, that was a tremendous fact. That Dr. Lloyd-Jones had stood so apparently alone for a long time. And in doing so, he had seemed to lose influence. But the truth was that the day came when God was to honor his faithfulness to the truth. But it was faith in the truth. And brethren, what we need also is that same faith. If God does not bless us today or tomorrow, our faith does not rest in the success that we see, but in the persuasion that we have been given that this is the truth of God himself. Now I must stop on just this word. What a serious thing it is to die. Dr. Lloyd-Jones spoke all his ministry on the fact that here we have no continuing city. And yet, you know, when he came near to the end, even he had to say that death was a greater thing, a more serious thing than ever he had been able to begin to say. In death, we go alone into the presence of God. In death, we have to forget all human judgments, all the opinions of men, and we have to go and give an account to God. At death, all our opportunities end. All our work ends in this world. With me it is a very small thing, says the Apostle Paul, that I should be judged of you or of any man. That was the doctor's spirit. My friends and brethren in the ministry, we need a much deeper realization of the seriousness of the work that we are about. We need to make death our company keeper in a way that another generation did. Not in a negative sense, but rather in the sense of anticipation, of a sense now of coveting more the knowledge of the Savior to whom, by God's grace, we trust we shall go. Death is a very serious thing. When Dr. Lloyd-Jones was a young minister, and I will finish with this anecdote, he was called to the deathbed of an old minister, the Reverend Joseph Jenkins, a man who had been used of God in the 1904 revival, a man who had helped Dr. Lloyd-Jones when he entered the ministry. And in 1929, Joseph Jenkins was dying. And the doctor went to see him, some distance from Port Talbot where he was. It was a summer's day, and as he came near the house, the windows were open, and he could hear this old servant of Christ groaning in his bed. He was in much pain. And when he went to the door and Mrs. Jenkins opened it, she said to the doctor, of course delighted to see him, but afraid that her husband would not know him. So they went into the room, and Dr. Lloyd-Jones took hold of old Mr. Jenkins' hand. And Mrs. Jenkins said to her husband, "My dear, do you know who this is?" The old man looks. "Of course I know," he says. "Of course I know." And then he says to Dr. Martyn, he says, "Can you pull me out of this river?" he said. "I never knew that the old river was so wide." And a few more words. He was in the passage through Jordan. "I don't know that I can do that," said Dr. Lloyd-Jones to Mr. Jenkins. "It's all right," said Mr. Jenkins. "I'm going to Jesus Christ." But then, throwing his hand on his chest, he said, "But I wish I felt it more here." Well, brethren, that is our position. If we are Christians, we are going to the one who is the author and finisher of our faith. We are surrounded by a great company of witnesses. We have to remember them. We have to mark them as long as we live. We have a duty to pass on to generations to come. And God has greatly privileged us to have his servant among us these many years.